So in my last presentation on the technical report, I gave kind of an overview of how to go about beginning your research and then some idea generation. I'm going to go into a little more detail on the report itself in this presentation, but you need again to read that chapter very carefully. I know I say that every single recording because, for example, the examples of the types of analysis there are extremely useful. There are models of the end and front material that you have to develop for this right there. And it's a matter, I'll tell you briefly what each is for, but it's really just a matter of looking at the pattern, looking at the model, and copying that. Our goal is to give you a chance to think about all the various bits and pieces that might go into a tech report, although, not no individual report will probably have all of those, but we'll touch on that in just a bit. So, um, some of the sorts of problems that you come up will trigger this kind of report. And again, we saw these three types of analysis in the last presentation, but just to reiterate, typically in the workplace, when a decision needs to be made based on or with a specific goal in mind, how is that decision best made? Well, it's best made when you are able to go out, gather data, gather information, conduct research, and then analyze that in order to generate recommendations. And the conclusion of a tech report usually includes some kinds of recommendations, regardless of what kind of analysis you're conducting. So again, just to recap these, a causal analysis is getting at what causes what. That's where the causal comes from. It's not a casual analysis, which sneaks in there sometimes. It's a causal analysis. Why does something happen? Or you could turn this around and say, what will happen if we do this? All right. So if we invest our money in this branch in this city, what will happen? What will the result of that be? A comparative analysis is weighing pros and cons for two different choices, comparing two items or two things, comparing two processes, comparing two modes of action. Feasibility analysis asks, is this a good idea? Or is it even possible? A combination of these is probably the most common form you will see, because it's relatively rare that any complex problem will lend itself only to a single form of analysis. So for example, you might do a comparative feasibility analysis. In other words, you're comparing two possible courses of action, but part of the comparison will be how feasible each one actually is. Or you may be using a comparative causal analysis. If we do this, what will happen next? Okay, well, if we do this, what will happen next? Or trying to solve a problem, could this be the problem? Well, let's compare the case or look at the things that make us think that might be the problem. Okay, well, now let's look at this other possible cause and see if that might be the problem and compare them to see which is more likely the cause of the issue. Elements of an effective analysis. First of all, you want to make sure you have a very clearly identified problem or purpose, goal for the tech report. So it can't just be about a thing in general. So it can't be about invasive species in the Great Lakes. It's really got to be more specific than that. And a lot of times when you identify the problem, you are also identifying or tying it to the form of analysis that you're going to undertake. So analyzing the sources of invasive species in the Great Lakes. That would be a causal analysis and be more specific than just invasive species. Dealing with the problem of invasive species would be causal/feasibility, and again, more specific than just talking about non-native species in Michigan lakes. Adequate but not excessive data. You want to find good, solid information upon which to conduct your analysis. You don't want to just find information for the sake of information. You don't want to have repetitive or redundant information, but you do want to make sure you've analyzed the subject in depth. You have a minimum of 5 sources for this essay, and they have to be a variety of sources. Read that carefully on the instruction sheet for details of that. You may find that you need more, but you don't want to go into thing is, for an 8-page or so essay report, if you've got 9, 10, 11 sources, there's a really good chance your sources are writing the report for you. Finally, make sure your information is accurate. Evaluate your sources well. I'll talk a little bit about how to do that in a future presentation. But also, make sure the data is balanced. So you may go into the analysis of the problem with a certain outcome in mind. You want to make sure the data is across the spectrum of opinion on the subject so you can draw a valid conclusion. This is not a persuasive essay. You're not trying to prove your point. You are trying to gather data, and again, think about this, in order usually to inform a decision. Now, do you want to give your manager bad data. They make a bad decision, the company loses money, and it's based on your bias going into this report. So you have to be very, very cautious. Fully interpreted data, you always want to make sure that anything you do include gets discussed and brought into the analysis. Don't just throw in information and leave it kind of hanging there. Subordinate your personal bias. We've talked about that quite a bit. I should not have a sense of how you feel about this beyond what conclusions the data suggests to you. And then visuals. And there's a wonderful chapter you'll be reading in the text. I'll talk a little bit about visuals, give some examples, but the chapter gives you a wonderful breakdown of when to use what visuals. So strategic use of appropriate visuals, extremely useful. The elements, the overall flow of it in the introduction of your tech report, and this is after the front material I'll talk about in just a second. You identify where your topic came from, you identify its significance, you outline the main problem and explain what you're about in this report. What is the purpose of your report? You will also want to lay out the type of research you conducted. For this report, I looked at the census information, I looked at this, I looked at that, and then explain anything you couldn't quite deal with, any limitations or omissions. For example, and this is perfectly valid for this particular assignment, if you had a really great source, you used interlibrary loan hoping you get it in time and it didn't come, you can address that in your introduction. There's this one source I wanted to look at, it didn't come in time, here's what I'd hope to do with it, and here's how I've dealt with its lack or its absence. The body is where you lay out your findings in an organized way. You can incorporate here your interpretations and some of the logical reasoning that's going to come into your conclusion. But the conclusion is where you're going to draw your conclusion, because that's why they're called the conclusion, and then make your recommendations. You want to use the visual techniques we looked at for the instructions in terms of topics, subtopics, headings, subheadings, and those sorts of things. You want to use those in the body to help readers negotiate, find their way around, navigate your tech report. The conclusion finally summarizes your main findings, interprets, applies a final analysis, and then makes recommendations. You don't want to include radically new information in the conclusion, but the conclusion may be the first place you mention some of your recommendations, but as long as it's based on what's come before, you're perfectly fine. Causal analysis, just a few tips. First of all, be sure the cause fits the effect. If you attribute a false cause to something, that's actually a logical fallacy, and the whole thing will fall apart. And it's really easy for that to happen, especially if two things kind of happen at the same time or one just before the other. It's really easy to attribute the latter to the former. So if there is a recall of a GM vehicle, and then suddenly the economy in Michigan goes down, you know, our economy is tied to the auto industry, yes, of course. Is that enough of a cause for that? Probably not. If there is direct evidence that did cause the downturn, then it's the evidence that will argue that. You can't just say, well, because this happened and then that happened, the first caused the second. So make the links very clear, and also distinguish between possible, probable, and definite causes. So yes, this definitely caused this to happen. Or yeah, I think this might have caused this to happen. Or yeah, this probably did, but I'm not completely certain. Again, the goal is to give a solid analysis, which people will use for decision making. So you want to make sure you are accurately representing how confident you feel about your conclusions. The comparative analysis, first of all, criteria come first with comparative analysis. So make sure you've got clear and definite criteria. Those are the points of comparison. So what makes a good blah, right? Or what will make this, how will we evaluate the outcome of this process? A list of things that you can use to compare. Make sure you give each item balanced treatment. In other words, if you're comparing a Mac and an Apple and you love apples, Mac and an Apple and a PC, and you love the Apple, but you may find yourself kind of skewing your report towards the Apple because of your feelings about it. So make sure you're being fair with both, because you never know, you could be wrong, or for that given situation, the thing that you are inclined to put forward might not work. Be sure to use lots of examples throughout. You need lots of examples, any of these analyses, but especially for comparative analysis, if you're comparing two features of something, provide specifics. Follow either a block pattern in which you talk about each item in turn. So I'm going to talk about the Corolla, then I'll talk about the Focus. Or point by point. I'll compare mileage for both cars, then I'll compare cost for both cars, and I'll compare reliability for both cars. One or the other. And then if it's an evaluative comparison, which most of these will be, you're trying to evaluate, in the conclusion, you'll give us your final judgment, which is better. Or if they're neck and neck, then you can nuance it by talking about which might be better for a given purpose. Finally, for the feasibility analysis, first of all, if you're trying to evaluate a good idea, you just want to make sure all the arguments upon which you base the decision, whether that's going to be good or bad, are really strong. So consider the strength of the supporting reasons for making that decision or going forward with that plan, and consider the strength of the opposing reasons, and really weigh that. Are they backed in data? Are they backed in solid information? Are the rationale appropriate for the situation, for the company, and for those involved? And then recommend a realistic course of action, something that your report has formed a kind of a solid basis for saying, yes, this would work or could work. The realistic course of action might not be a complete fix. It might be a compromise suggestion based on the foregoing weighing of supporting and opposing reasons. Finally, I'll just quickly touch on this front and end matter. You remember from the assignment sheet, you do need to have this stuff in there. Letter of transmittal is a letter that goes along with the report to say, here's the report. Usually what it does is it indicates why this person's receiving the report. So if somebody requested the report, your letter of transmittal will say, as per your request back then, here is the letter of transmittal. How much detail goes into this, and it will depend on the situation. If you're sending a report to somebody who you think will be able to find it very useful, but who did not request it, then you're going to have to give more detail. You've got a report on an engineering issue that you want to send to the sales people or to finance because it will impact what they're doing. Then you need to give a good letter of transmittal explaining, listen, this is what you're getting this for, this is how you find it useful. If you're giving it to someone who requested it yesterday, well, then it's just, here's that report you asked for yesterday. Slightly more formal language, but that's basically the message. Title page gives the document title, names of authors. Again, just copy this from the text. That's all you have to do. Look in the textbook and see what content is here and include that. The title report just gives the salient information, the information the reader needs to know who produced this and then what it has to do with. Table of contents you should have highlighting your major sections. This is why you need topics and subtopics too for the table of contents. If you've got tables and figures, a list of those is really helpful with the page number. An abstract or executive summary, you've got to write one of these. It is a paragraph-long overview of your report. It is not an introduction, and it is not something designed to get your readers interested. It's a complete summary. And the reason it's there, I think the word executive summary gives you an idea why it's there. If somebody's an executive, somebody's very, very busy. If somebody has very little time to read this thing that's come across their desk, the executive summary gives them a bird's eye view of what's there. They can decide whether they need it or not. If they do, your summary will follow the organization of the original. Summaries always do that. So they'll be able to find what part of the report they most need to look at. Glossary, if you've got terminology that your readers might not understand and which is used often enough, they might want to refer back to. They might forget. You'll define it at one point in the text. But if it's something you're afraid they'll forget and they'll need to look at again, include a glossary of terminology. An appendix is something you add on to the end of the report with material that was referenced in the report, but which was too much to include. So like if you reference a table from the Census Bureau, you've got a few numbers from it, you think readers might find the rest of it interesting as well, but it's not completely, the rest of it's not really that important to your report. In the body, you'll pull out the material you need. In the appendix, you might include the entire table. You might include their your questionnaire if you do a survey, for example. Reference or works cited list is a must. MLA format, you've got to get that right. I'll do a presentation in MLA before all is said and done. I'll give you resources for MLA, but you've got to get that right. It's absolutely essential to be able to produce a proper in-text citations and end matter citations in academia and in the workplace too. If you're producing this type of writing in the workplace, you've got to make sure that readers know where the data has come from. Okay, and that is everything. So that's an overview for the tech report. We do have a few more presentations. I'll touch on some of the visuals, stuff on visuals. I'll touch on some of the stuff on source, evaluation, and MLA citation as we move forward, pulling together and wrapping up this tech report. But now you've got the building blocks to pull that final document together.